El Born is one of the three neighbourhoods of the medieval city, and the name is a medieval Catalan word referring to a space where they would have played a particular sport about 500 or 600 years ago. Now if you look straight down the street, you can see it's fairly narrow with a little bit of pavement down the middle where there would have been a dividing fence, and at either end of the street they'd have put a man on a horse in a suit of armour with a big stick, and they would have charged each other. It's the jousting run. If you go to the Gothic Quarter, the walls of the cathedral used to form part of this red nucleus, and this is the oldest part of Barcelona. That's the Roman city. The foundations there are more than 2,000 years old. And if you go under the cathedral via the museum, you can still see the Roman streets which are there beneath it. La Rambla, this is the old medieval wall. So that dates from 1050 to about 1250. And the blue lines around Raval and El Born are the newer medieval bits. So they date from 1250 up until 1701. Spain is actually composed of 17 autonomous communities. And these communities work a little bit like the states do in the US. Not as much autonomy, but it's a similar sort of idea. But Catalonia is one of the oldest. It used to be a principality under the crown of Aragon. Aragon's one of these various medieval polities. And in the 15th century, they all came together under the same crown to form the kind of geographical borders of modern Spain. However, even though all these different areas have been united under the same monarchy, politically they stayed quite separate for another few hundred years. In 1701, the King of Spain, called Carlos El Hechizado, Spanish for Charles, the Bewitched. But Charles is not bewitched or cursed. What do royal families need to do to keep their blood pure?
Breed.
With whom?
Themselves.
With themselves. It's a very diplomatic way of saying incest, okay? If you ever see a painting of him, it's not a Picasso. He looked like that. He had what is known as the Habsburg jaw, which is a very elongated underbite from all those generations of inbreeding. He couldn't walk properly, struggled to talk properly. And he died quite young, at the age of 38, unsurprisingly, without any kids. So it leaves Spain without a monarch, and that precipitated the Spanish War of Succession. And in this war, there are two contenders to succeed to the throne. On the one side, we had Felipe of Anjou, who's part of the Bourbon dynasty in France, and the other side would later have Charles, who was the Archduke of the Habsburg Empire in what is now Austria, Hungary, Germany, and parts of the Netherlands. And most of Spain supported the Bourbons. The Catalans, however, as they often do, did the opposite of the rest of Spain, and they supported the Habsburgs. And that's because the Habsburgs has basically promised to respect their laws, their separate institutions, and their language. But, as they also often do in wars, they support the loser. So the war went from 1701 to 1713, and Barcelona, which as you can see in the picture was a walled city at the time, it managed to hang on for one more year in a siege, but on the 11th of September 1714, it was forced to surrender. And when it surrendered, the Bourbon forces poured into the city through this corner, executing the defenders and destroying large swathes of the urban area. 300 years ago, this wasn't a square. It was about 1,000 different homes. About 15% of the city would have lived and worked here, and the Bourbons flattened a lot of it. So a lot of people say this is the birthplace of Catalan nationalism. If they fly this flag, they want Catalonia to be an independent republic outside of Spain. The entire movement really begins here 300 years ago. If you look at the floor, as you walk and cycle around, you can actually see that they've redesigned it to show you where the rest of the buildings used to be. So these are the walls of the houses here. You can see there's probably a front door over there opening up onto the street. The different colours are the cobbles joining from the passage onto the bornet inside. Okay, so as you cycle around, you can actually see where the rest of the city was 300 years ago or so. Today, Barcelona is one of the most densely populated cities in Europe. We're about comparable to Paris in terms of people per square mile. And has anybody managed to smell the old town yet? I'll take that as a yes then. You can imagine what that was like 200 years ago, before there was sanitation and people were throwing their chamber pots out of bedroom windows, okay? And in the 19th century, they thought it was the bad smells, the miasmas, which were causing diseases. The solution, therefore, is to create spaces which smelt nicer. And this is one of those. So in the 1860s, they knocked down those old medieval walls and they got rid of most of the military buildings. There's only 3 buildings which remain today, which are contemporary with the original fortification, and they are those 3 around us here. And the most important one for us is the one just behind you, over here, because this was originally the arsenal, or the armoury, where they kept all the weapons and the explosives. It was later briefly turned into a royal palace, but if you look just above the doorway there, you can see that you don't need to speak fluent Catalan to see what it is today. This is the Parliament of Catalonia. So when Spain became a democracy again in 1978 and it devolved power to each of those 17 autonomous communities, this became the centre of democracy here in Catalonia. Did anybody see our referendum in 2017? So if you don't know, we had a referendum on independence in 2017, only recognising Catalonia, and we declared ourselves an independent republic for 45 seconds. So this is where they ratified the vote, where they all sang their patriotic songs, and where many had to run away from when the police arrived. Okay, so it all took place here. What's that? Over 7 years ago now. So the first World's Fair in Spanish history, probably the most important, was held in this park in 1888. And this was, as I say, the artistic focus for the World's Fair. And as a work of art, it's interesting because it is a celebration of progress and modernity. It's a celebration of the Catalan identity, but there's also a criticism of industrialisation hidden here as well. So if we start at the very top, we can see the last covered in gold, okay? This is Aurora. Now, Aurora is the Roman goddess of the dawn, of the sunrise. You can see that in her right hand, she's holding a torch, just like the Statue of Liberty. And that torch represents enlightenment, progress, freedom, all of the things which Catalonia felt like it was finally regaining in the new dawn of the industrial era. Just below her in the shell, we can see Venus, or Aphrodite, who was famously born from the sea, just as Barcelona itself was born from the sea when the Romans first crossed the Mediterranean, when the ships used to come in the medieval period, and of course with the Industrial Revolution itself. And then around the front here, we've got these griffins, or these dragons. Now, dragons are very important to the Catalan identity. Has anybody seen dragons around the city, yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah? It's about 400 if you know where to look. And this is because the patron saint of Catalonia in Catalan is called Saint Jordi. This is the legend of Saint George slaying the dragon. So Eixample is Catalan, it just means the expansion, planned by a guy called Ildefons Cerdà, who was very influenced by the French utopian socialists. And so he designed Barcelona to be a completely egalitarian city. For that reason, there are three very distinctive features you'll notice about the design. Firstly, as you can see, it's very, very American in many ways, very, very strict grid pattern, a bit like Washington, DC, actually, with the two intersecting streets there. And this goes back to that Enlightenment idea about how rationality would solve the problems of the modern world. So try to make the city as logical as possible. The other thing they did was to make sure all of the buildings had the same dimensions, so they're all almost perfect squares, and they were all limited to about 6 floors. And the last thing you might notice is, if you look at the intersections, none of these buildings have any corners. They've actually cut all of the corners off to make these chamfers. Now this goes back to the idea about the bad smells causing diseases. The solution in the new part of the city was to cut the corners off to let in as much air, as much light as possible, which would mean that no matter what class you were born in or what neighbourhood you lived in, your air quality, and therefore your health, would be as good as everybody else's. Merci. Hasta el 40 de mayo, no te quites el sayo, which is until the 40th of May, don't forget your rain jacket, basically. In 1931, we had local elections here in Spain, but we used these elections as essentially a referendum on the monarchy. So this is the same Bourbon monarchy which had conquered Catalonia in 1714, but it had since become very unpopular around the rest of Spain as well. So they essentially used it as a plebiscite, and in 1931, Spain became a republic for the second time in its history. And as it became a republic, they set about trying to reform the country by establishing a public education system, modernising the economy, and separating church from state, for example. However, you have to put this into the context of the rest of Europe, because we already have fascism just across the water there in Italy, and we already had the Nazi party consolidating power in Germany. So even as the Republic progresses, we start to see the same far-right fascist movement spring up here in Spain. And things hit crisis point in 1936, when Francisco Franco, who is one of the leaders of the Spanish army, he had very close connections to Mussolini, decided it was time for a coup d'etat. The idea was to seize Madrid, reinstate the monarchy, reinstate the powers of the church, and make Spain a centralised authoritarian country. But the Republic fought back, and the next 3 years are what we call the Spanish Civil War. Now in English, probably the most famous representations come on the one hand from Ernest Hemingway, who wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is a fictionalisation of some of the things that he saw here whilst he was working as a journalist. And we also have George Orwell, who came here to fight. So Orwell landed in the Rambla, signed on to a political party, and because of his experience in the British Army, he led a battalion in the International Brigades. And he wrote his memoirs in a book called A Homage to Catalonia, which, if you're interested, is a great place to start because it's a really vivid first-hand account of some of the street battles that took place here in the Gothic Quarter and some of the trench warfare on the Ebro front. But it wasn't just the writers, we also had the painters getting involved, and perhaps most famously of all was Pablo Picasso, who painted what is perhaps his most iconic image. This is called Guernica. Now, Guernica is actually a little town outside of Bilbao, the spiritual home of the Basques, and quite similar to Catalonia in that it was very industrialised, very republican, and they have their own language and identity as well. So it became one of the prime targets for the fascists trying to undermine the Spanish economy. And in the Civil War, Most of the democracies around the world basically turned their back on Spain and said that's nothing to do with us, they can sort it out themselves. But the fascists in Spain had the full support of the fascists from around Europe. And so Franco basically invited them all here to try out any new weapons and any new techniques that they wanted. And so Guernica, this little town outside of Bilbao in the Basque country, essentially became the first victim of the Luftwaffe. And that kind of carpet bombing technique we'd later see used across Poland, France, the Netherlands and Britain. And it absolutely razed the city to the ground. So as a warning to the rest of Europe and to try to encourage people to come out to Spain to fight, Picasso painted this image here. Now the photo just above it is a similar story, but here in Barcelona. This is in the Plaça Sant Felip Neri, which is just next to the main cathedral in the Gothic Quarter. But in the Civil War, it was basically being used as an orphanage and an air raid shelter. And in 1938, it was hit directly by 2 Italian fascist bombs. And it killed about 50 people. So if you go there nowadays, they've since cleared away the rubble and they've fixed the doors of the church, but the facade of the building looks exactly as it does in this photo here. And they left it that way as a kind of a commemoration of the crimes committed against the civilian population here in Barcelona. However, in spite of everybody's best efforts, the Republic does fall and Franco becomes the dictator of Spain until his death in November 1975. Now when he died, he left instructions that the Bourbons should once again become the monarchy, which they do. So Spain still has a Bourbon monarchy today. But at this point in time, we're seeing lots of strikes, lots of civil disobedience, and Spain wants to join the ECC, which later becomes the European Union. And to be a member of the European Union, you need to be a democracy. So the people in power said, right, let's try and take things slowly and smoothly, and we'll have a transition to democracy. And that's what we call it in Spanish, la transición. And la transición are the 2 or 3 years in which they reform the courts, rewrite the constitution, and put everything to a referendum in December 1978. And it was approved. So Spain became a democracy fairly peacefully for the first time since before the Second World War. However, just because it's developing socially and politically very quickly doesn't mean economically it's keeping a pace. So you can see here where we just cycled through was basically factories and chimneys and train lines and things like that. But the beaches were very, very polluted. The river Bessos, actually, to the north of the city, had the dubious distinction of being the most polluted river outside of the Soviet Union. And the beaches themselves had basically been lost to shanty towns and old abandoned fishermen's huts. And it was essentially one event at the end of the 80s and in the early 90s which changed the fortunes of everything you can see around us here. So in 1986, Barcelona wins the right to host the 1992 Olympics, beating Madrid. Largely because of that, okay? Because if you think about it, Madrid is the geographical centre of Spain. So it's very well connected to everything, but it's in the middle of a desert. So it's not very easy to hold the whole sailing events. Whereas here, we have the full Mediterranean at our disposal. So they took the opportunity of changing all of that into everything you can see around you here. Over there, we can see the orange buildings, okay? So this is all part of the Olympic Village. So that's where all of the athletes would have stayed in the 92 Olympic Games. All that is, except for the American basketball team, who stayed in the 5-star hotel.
Dream team, babe.
Well, exactly right. This is where the dream team stayed. And you might have noticed as we went past, there is a casino beneath it, which probably explains everything you need to know. Now, these 2 buildings themselves were built specifically for the Olympics to be the 2 tallest in the city, which they still are, okay? They're 154 metres each. The one on the left remains a 5-star hotel. Just next to the Hotel of Arts, we have a work of art that was given to us for the Olympics by Frank Gehry, and this is known as the Pêche d'Or, the goldfish. And according to Gehry, it's a goldfish without a head or a tail because it looks neither towards the future nor the past, but lives in the moment, which I wanted people to enjoy the Olympic Games in '92. And if you look straight across the water there, you can see Montjuic. Now, Montjuic is where they actually attacked the city in 1714. You can see there is a castle on top of it there. But it's up there that they decided to put the Olympic Stadium. Now, there is only one reason why you'd put an Olympic Stadium on top of a mountain, and that's because it looks great on television. Every time you have the running, the swimming, the athletics and the diving, you can see the entire cityscape behind it. And so it's essentially one big marketing campaign to show the world that Spain was once again a modern European democracy. You can actually go to this bar now, this is called Salts, which is part of the municipal pool. So you could go out there, have a little beer and overlook the city, and you will see the Sagrada Familia. So when it's finished, it's going to reach 172.5 metres. That will make it the tallest building in the city. Nothing will allow it to be taller than it. And it will also be the tallest religious building in the world at that point. But it is 172.5 for a very specific reason. And that's because Gaudi's biggest influence in life was always nature. So he tried to incorporate nature into every facet of his work. But he was also very religious. He did say that nature was the work of God, and therefore no work of man can ever be greater than the work of nature. And the greatest work of nature in Barcelona is Montjuic, which is 173 metres tall. So when it's finished, the main tower of the Sagrada will be half a metre shorter than Montjuic, just so as not to outdo God's work. With any luck, that should be finished by 2026, which is the centenary of Gaudi's death.